Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. On a beautiful spring day, it's so nice to finally have some warmth and sunshine after all that rain. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you, both those of you here in person, and we also have some folks who are watching on Zoom, to this program today, how a Stanford speech scandal led to the invention of academic freedom, the case of Edward A. Ross, hosted and organized by the Stanford Historical Society and co-presented by the Stanford Graduate School of Education. My name is Leslie Kim, and I am co-chair of the Historical Society's Program Committee. Before we begin, I want to extend a special thanks to those of you who are members of the Stanford Historical Society for your support, which makes these programs and our other important historical resources possible. As our members know, the Society is an independent, volunteer-driven organization devoted to the scholarship and sharing of Stanford history. And we rely heavily on membership dues and donations to keep our work going and to provide content such as what you'll be hearing today. Anyone who's interested can join the Society, which you can do on our website, historicalsociety.stanford.edu. We will start with a few words by Dean Deborah Satz. Dean Satz is the Vernon R. and Lisbeth Warren Anderson Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences, as well as the Marta Sutton Weeks Professor of Philosophy, and by courtesy of Political Science. She is also the J. Frederick and Elizabeth Brewer Weins Fellow in Undergraduate Education, and past president of the Stanford chapter of the American Association of University Professors, which we will learn has its origins in the story that will be presented today. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dean Satz.
I'm delighted to be here, and I really want to thank the Historical Society for putting on this event. These are issues that are really fundamental and very important, issues about academic freedom. The freedom to pursue knowledge free from various kinds of constraints is vital to universities. And I include among the constraints it's important to be free from the need to appease orthodoxy, the need to make a profit, the need to deliver short-term results, and the need to serve private interests. Being free from those constraints is really special because lots of work that goes on in the world is not free from such constraints. So that's one piece, but not the only piece of what counts as academic freedom, is the freedom from those constraints. Academic freedom isn't identical to freedom of speech. As the Yale law professor Robert Post once put it, no astronomy department is going to hire somebody who believes the moon is made of green cheese and writes about it. But that person has a First Amendment right to hold that view. But academic freedom doesn't include the freedom to just do whatever the First Amendment allows you to do. And there's a lot to be said about these issues, but I'm not the speaker and I'm not going to go on about that. Although these issues are distinct, there are overlaps. And in both cases, in the case of freedom of speech and in the case of academic freedom, we need to be concerned about a human tendency to groupthink and conformism and to the chilling of new ideas. And the enemies of one kind of freedom of speech, tend to be enemies of academic freedom and vice versa, although not always, but often these things go together. And right now we're seeing an incredible assault on academic freedom from state governments, from boards of overseers, from groups like Campus Watch, which target liberal professors, and from a growing intolerance of unorthodox views among our students. All of these contribute to a threat to our academic freedom. Founded in 1915, in the wake of the firing of about 10 faculty at different universities, including not only Stanford's Edward Ross, who you'll be hearing about today, but also the University of Pennsylvania economist Scott Nearing, who was fired for criticizing child labor, the AAUP is an incredibly important bulwark for academic freedom's defense. And I want to just say it is an important bulwark, not only in the past where it served this role, but today. When I was president of the AAUP chapter here at Stanford, the AAUP defended a group of long-term lecturers who were facing unfair dismissal. Stanford's administrators backed down. Now I'm an administrator, so I know it's not easy to back down. And the lecturers kept their jobs only because of the AAUP intervention. We shouldn't ever take academic freedom for granted. Now, there's a quote I really like from the former president of Penn, Amy Gutmann, who gave a presidential lecture at Stanford. And here's what she says. Quote, "It's easy to forget that American colleges and universities derive their greatness not by echoing conventional views of society or carrying the partisan banner of governments or giving aid or comfort to purveyors of prejudices. Rather, they do so by protecting the freedom of professors and students to read widely and explore topics in their complexity, to think critically and debate issues where there are grounds for reasonable disagreement, and to imagine and express new ideas without fear of reprisal or retribution." I really hope that the next generation of scholars will work to reinvigorate the AAUP, both as a national organization, but also here at Stanford, and otherwise play an important role in interrogating the meaning and limits of academic freedom and also defending it. And we are very fortunate to have Emily Levine here today. Gives me great pleasure. She's somebody who has thought about the issues of academic freedom for a long time. She's now serving on a university committee that will be looking at the shape and texture of academic freedom at Stanford, something, again, very, very important. She's thought deeply about the history of the concept. She may be speaking about this today, but she has criticized the early 1950 AAUP vision of academic freedom as substantially negative, as freedom from, which partly was the way I was defining it, freedom from various kinds of constraints. And she's argued you really need to think also about the freedom for or the freedom to. What do you want academic freedom to provide, to have a positive vision of it? So I'm really looking forward to her discussion today on the leading up to the AAUP and the beginning of defense of academic freedom in America. She's the author of 2 books. The first one, The Dreamland of Humanists, Warburg, Koissira, Panofsky, and the Hamburg School. And I may be one of the only people in the room, maybe not the only one who knows all those figures, but that's being a philosopher. And her recent and quite excellent Allies and Rivals, German-American Exchange and the Rise of the Modern Research University, which I saw is for sale outside. So please join me in welcoming Emily Levine.
Thank you, Dean Satz, for that generous and thoughtful introduction, and to Charlotte, Jonathan, and Leslie of the Stanford Historical Society for the invitation to speak, and to the Graduate School of Education, and especially Jeff Cox and John Baker for their support with this event. I also want to thank the teaching team for a new undergraduate course, Stanford and Its Worlds, 1885 to the present, and all of our students from that course who are joining us tonight. I'm currently co-teaching the course with Professor Mitchell Stevens and University Archivist Josh Snyder, together with graduate students Abby Kahn, David Bates, and Max Nachtwey, for whose research support for this talk I'm especially grateful. We are developing Stanford and Its Worlds as a model for how to make the history of Stanford a part of the curriculum, and in turn, how we can take responsibility for telling the story of this institution in a way that informs our present and shapes our future. And this talk comes as much out of our collaboration as it does out of my own personal work. So when my former professor, friend, and colleague, Peter Stansky, suggested to me over 2 years ago that I present on academic freedom for the Society, he assured me it would be a fun and light event. We would sell my book and drink lemonade. So I did not anticipate that academic freedom at Stanford would be propelled to the center of national debate. So thank you, Peter, who's watching, I know, on Zoom. I'm sure we've all by now read of the disruption last month of Judge Kyle Duncan's speech at a Federalist Society event at the law school and read Dean Martinez's response. In the weeks since, school after school have renewed their dual commitments to the open exchange of ideas and the inclusion of all views. One commentator quoted in the New York Times cited the Stanford effect to describe the turn to a more productive conversation on campuses grounded in shared norms and values. Okay, so if academic freedom is front page news, why root around in the past? Because, as I'll argue today, the idea of academic freedom is a modern invention. In Edward A. Ross's day, it was nothing new for professors to be fired for saying and doing things that rubbed administrators and their communities the wrong way. What we call academic freedom and take for granted as a feature of the American university did not exist. The convention that prevailed before 1915 in America dictated that American faculty possessed no formal rights or economic security with respect to their employment. Now, many concepts and traditions that are embedded in the academy go unquestioned. They're assumed to be eternal, and they're mythologized that way. But under historical analysis, we can see that these concepts were in fact fashioned by people in particular places and times. And the story of how, when, why, and by whom academic freedom was created exposes the fault lines of current debates, the consequences of decisions made, and opens new and perhaps more robust formulations for the future. Now, I want to be clear about what concept I'm describing here. Academic freedom has a complicated history, made more complicated by the fact that it is both a professional ideal and a constitutional concept. Then there's a separate First Amendment right to free speech. The newly convened ad hoc university-wide committee that Dean Satz mentioned, chaired by Professor Bernie Myler, uses the capacious term university speech to encompass the range of categories relevant to us at Stanford. Tonight, my focus is the historical origins of the professional ideal of academic freedom, not the legal concept, and not all university speech. And in doing so, I hope to complement the work of my law colleagues, Professor Myler and also Dean Martinez, Professor Paul Brest, and those at other universities like Robert Post, whom Dean Satz mentioned at Yale. In the historical field, excavating the origins of ideas is called historicization. One benefit of working together with the social scientists is that I've gotten very precise with my definitions, or I risk being called out. So here we go. By reinserting an idea back into the time and place in which it was first located, we see that the history didn't have to end up this way. There was nothing preordained about the way academic freedom played out in American higher education. And exposing the contingency of ideas, it becomes clear that the concepts that we have inherited resulted from decisions that were made by people empowered to do so at that time. And I want to suggest should prompt a conversation about how we should refashion that idea for our own age and for our own community. So tonight's talk has 3 sections. I'll first offer a historical account of the Ross affair, focusing on the relationships among Jane Stanford, David Starr Jordan, and Edward Ross, and explain how each narrated those events to serve their interests. Then I'll explain how the national fallout from the so-called Ross affair led to the founding of the American Association of the University Professors, the AAUP, and its first publication, the 1915 Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure. And then finally, I'll return to offer some concluding thoughts on how history might inform our current conversations. Okay, so the Ross affair occurred at one of the worst moments in Stanford's early history. Knowing nothing about universities other than that they wanted to found one, the Stanfords wisely sought to emulate the up-and-coming institutions they visited in the summer of 1884, Johns Hopkins, MIT, and Cornell, each which in different ways combined the two tasks, the dissemination of knowledge or teaching with the advancement of knowledge or research, which was the hallmark of the new modern university. Of course, the Stanfords didn't just want to imitate the already established Eastern institutions, they wanted to one-up them, right, as evidenced by this monumental architecture I submit to you as Exhibit A. And so Stanford further distinguished itself by emphasizing knowledge that was useful. On opening day in October 1891, Governor Leland Stanford told the pioneering class, "Remember that life is above all practical. You are here to fit yourself for a useful career." The president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, thought them well-meaning but misguided. Nicholas Murray Butler, soon to be president of Columbia, and one of the 3 men offered the job of the presidency before David Starr Jordan, considered them naive. The Stanfords were ready to prove the skeptical Northeasterners wrong. And the founding was auspicious enough. As David Starr Jordan later recalled, the university opened on the first day of October, 1891, a clear, bright, golden California day, typical of California October and full of good omen, as all days in California are likely to be. Certainly today, we can't complain. So what could go wrong? Well, 2 years later, it seemed like the scrappy startup, Leland Stanford Junior University, might fold before it launched. When Edward Ross arrived at Stanford from Indiana in 1893, Leland Sr. had just died. There was a run on the banks. The federal government froze the Stanford's assets while it tried to recoup funds invested in the Central and Southern Pacific railroads. Leland's widow, Jane, was left in control of what seemed like an ill-conceived and ill-funded institution. She heroically reduced her staff of servants from 17 to 3. She slept in her private car of her railroad train to save money and sold her jewels to keep the university afloat. So, who were the key players of our drama today? Well, I mentioned Jane first. The virtuous widow, usually presented as heroically living out the plans of her husband. She assumed control of the university when females in academia were rare. To be sure, she endured sexism, maligned as the university dowager, and routinely criticized for taking things too personally. Even Jordan's alleged praise of her as a lone, sad figure of the mother of the university, strong in her trust in God and in her loyalty to her husband's purposes, just drips of condescension. But sexism aside, it's also true that Jane could be petty, bitter, and take things too personally, making institutional decisions based on personal reasons, something that would reveal itself in the Ross affair. Jane also often repeated the most anti-intellectual cant of her husband, ridiculing the graduates of Yale and Harvard, who with their useless degrees were now working for her husband's railroad, and pleaded for Jordan to make machine shops and woodworking major subjects at Stanford. Effectively the sole trustee of the university, she viewed Stanford as an industrialist might have viewed a mill town that they built for their employees, that is, with hers. At the height of the financial crisis of 1893, it is more than symbolic that Jane paid the faculty, albeit sporadically, in bags of gold that a California judge had allocated for her personal servants. So who's next on the stage? We have then Jordan, David Starr Jordan, a Cornell-educated botanist and natural scientist who taught at Midwestern institutes and colleges. He later became an ichthyologist. That was a new word for me. A scholar of fishes, and in 1879 was named professor of zoology at Indiana University, and later its president. He was recommended for the job by his mentor, Cornell president Andrew Dixon White. And Jordan shared with Jane and Leland their roots in upstate New York, a modest upbringing, a religious background, and having lost his wife and daughter, he was also grief-stricken. When he visited Palo Alto for the first time, he apparently remarked, "No more beautiful site for a university exists in the world." To fill the ranks of his new university, though, Jordan had to rely on emerging talent and loyal colleagues and friends from Indiana, including Edward Ross. So enter Ross. Born in Verdun, Illinois, Ross was the son of a farmer and a school teacher. He was sheltered by an Iowa farming family after he was orphaned at a young age. He received an A.B. degree at Coe College, and then after a year in Berlin, as was customary at the time, he received a PhD in economics in 1891 from Johns Hopkins, the blue chip university of its day, where he worked with the foremost economist Richard T. Ely and later to be President Woodrow Wilson. Ross was quickly snapped up by Indiana and then Cornell, but eventually accepted a position at Stanford in 1893, where he served until 1900, when he was dismissed. He spent the rest of his career at the University of Wisconsin, retiring as the author of 27 books and over 300 articles in what was now the established field of sociology. And I learned yesterday from my colleague, Professor Matt Snip, a sociologist who went to University of Wisconsin, that when one defends their dissertation in sociology, you do so in a grand room with the portrait of Edward Ross staring down at you. Ross was handsome, charismatic, tall, and a popular teacher, careless of garb or appearance, keen of wit, but free of speech, as one contemporary described him, one therefore who was likely to attract or to repel others. So Jordan and Ross shared a number of characteristics. Both were scientists from the Midwest, not the East Coast establishment. Both traveled to and fell in love with what Jordan called the charm of California. Ross, like Jordan, quickly ascended the ranks of the American Academy. He was secretary of the new American Economic Association when he arrived at Stanford. And both were products of 19th century progressive era politics. And here's where definitions, I think, are also useful. That is, they believed that science could be used to reform society, a principle that also distinguished social science. And like many social and natural scientists of the day, Ross was also a eugenicist, believing that reproduction itself could be harnessed and controlled to ensure the inheritance of desirable traits and to prevent the inheritance of the less desirable ones. Ross was part of what John Dewey called the new social sciences, an approach not yet defined in strictly disciplinary terms that include a combination of economics, politics, and social thought. And the field of sociology would emerge from this constellation. And these social scientists believed that there were social laws and that they could be identified and that they could account for how society functioned, and crucially, that that functioning could then be harnessed, controlled, and thereby improved. And this tension between understanding and changing the world was at the root of these new social sciences, but it was also a kind of microcosm for the solidifying American Academy. And the delicate way that this relationship was reconciled is one of the many sort of paradoxes embodied in the university. We'll come back to that theme quite a bit. Articulated in the founding grant in 1885, as these tensions were emerging, Stanford itself sat at the juncture between understanding and changing the world, with its emphasis on usefulness and public service, about which we just heard. If you read the excerpt from this founding grant, the founding grant from 1885, you'll see it identifies the following purpose of this new institution: to promote the public welfare by exercising an influence in behalf of humanity and civilization. Ross's interpretation of the promotion of the public welfare would expose the tension between understanding and reforming in this university's mission. And as we'll see, the ways that those lines between scholarship and politics, university and society were redrawn after the Ross affair set the new terms of engagement, reciprocity, and self-governance for the modern era. Okay, so what happened? This is a really complicated story. It took 5 of us to piece it together, and I'm still not sure that I'm going to get this right, but I'll give it a try. So in 1896, Jane hears Ross is maligning the railroad industry. Namely, she hears that he says in class, "The railroad deal is a railroad steal," which he later denied. But nonetheless, he clearly criticized the policies of Leland Stanford, and Jane gives Jordan a recommendation that he be fired. It's reported in the press then shortly thereafter that Ross joins the Democratic William Jennings Bryan's presidential campaign, a Democrat who was supported by the populists and who advocated for the silver monetary policy, sort of rallying cry for the populist movement. The capitalists were for gold and the populists were for what was called bimetallism. Ross gives a series of lectures about this topic that are then turned into a pamphlet called Honest Dollars, and some 40,000 copies are distributed by the Democrats during the campaign. Again, Jane protests, this time asking Jordan to dismiss Ross. In 1897, the situation escalates when Ross speaks before a socialist group. Jane gives Jordan the power to dismiss and hire professors, but continues to put pressure on him privately. 1900, the final straw came in the spring when Ross takes up an invitation which Jordan himself had received, but declined, and urged Ross to take in his stead, to speak to the United Labor Organization. Now, Ross was anti-Asian immigration, which was a cornerstone of the anti-monopolist movement of the time. And Ross took the opportunity to indulge in anti-Japanese rhetoric, putting it mildly. His improvised words that got back to Jane were, quote, "Should the worst come to the worst, it would be better for us to turn our guns upon every vessel bringing Japanese to our shores than permit them to land." So the correspondence in the university archives shows the escalation of the situation. We see Jane writing in 1900, this is not the first time he's overstepped the bounds of propriety. Stanford University is not a political machine, nor should a professor of that college ever get up before a political organization and air his prejudices and his preferences. In a subsequent exchange, she opposed Ross's outbursts of partisanship. Jordan does his best to negotiate, right? For his part, he defends freedom of speech. Note here, he does not use the term academic freedom in spring of 1900. Ultimately, though, he relents and he writes solemnly to Ross that summer, the university should be a source of unprejudiced, sound, and conservative opinion, right? And honest dollars and, ostentatious, racist rhetoric at a rally to stir politics did not qualify. So, he continues to try, that is Jordan, to de-escalate the situation. As Richard White describes in his new book, Jordan even treats Ross like a baseball player, sort of trying to trade him. Maybe we can get another Midwestern sociologist here and we'll give you ours and all of this will go away. Jordan knew that Stanford's reputation would suffer in the case of a dismissal. But tired and out of options, on the 11th of November, Jordan accepted Ross's resignation, and the personnel case escalated to an affair. On the 14th of November, a story ran on the front page of the San Francisco newspaper, Dr. Edward Ross forced out of Stanford University. The next day, the Stanford Chronicle story said that Stanford forfeited the respect of the state and of the educational world. And the press just got worse from there. Ross claimed and corresponded that he had upwards of hundreds of articles published in support of his position. So that's what happened. But as I learned recently from my colleague, Jen Burns, who's an economic historian in the history department here, economists care about what happened and historians care about what people say happened. And in this case, what the players said happened was actually much more consequential. How they retold their story is instructive and, as I'll argue, kind of set the contours of the shape of the academy that we have inherited. So in October of 1902, Jane delivered a speech to the Board of Trustees in which she said that her wish was that the university shall forever be kept out of politics. She claimed that this prohibition on partisanship was in the founding grant all along. It wasn't. And then in April 1903, she delivered another speech to the Board of Trustees in which she again titled Address on the Right of Free Speech, she attempted to defend her actions, insisting that the university had always had a prohibition against partisanship. And actually there's thanks to the wonderful work of an economic historian, Warren Samuels, who's sort of recreated all of these, the sort of history of these documents, you can see the ways in which actually Jordan citing this alleged prohibition on partisanship, but he's citing speeches that Governor Stanford gave about Memorial Church, about non-sectarian religion. He's not actually citing the founding grant. And when you go back and look, you see that these layers and layers of amendments that Jane Stanford has sort of iterated on the original founding grant, in some ways is an attempt to kind of reinsert this prohibition that she thought should have been there kind of all along, right? This is creating a lot of confusion. Jordan, as we saw, defended free speech, not academic freedom. Academics were beginning to write about something they called academic freedom in the 1890s, albeit in a vague way. And after 1900, certainly Jordan was more chastened and wrote about it in a very qualified way. In this excerpt from The Voice of the Scholar from 1903, he writes, "Truth cannot exist in full degree for men without experience in life, for men who live in a visionary world, for men whose ready eloquence takes the place of science. The doctors of philosophy turn up in such numbers from the great hothouses of university culture are not always prepared for the freedom of a grown man must take." And you can kind of hear him almost kind of working out sort of what happened with Ross and this now very qualified understanding of what that freedom at a university should look like. Jordan's loyal secretary, Orrin Leslie Eliot, would go on to paint a portrait of Jordan as a champion of academic freedom, saying that he wrote to a colleague that he had resisted Jane's sort of requests as long as he could in the name of academic freedom. But despite trying, our research team has yet to turn up the actual letter that Eliot cites. And it seems to me more likely that this portrait of Ross was a post facto creation, a kind of creation that included an image of Stanford as a place where, well, the winds of freedom blow. Right? But the well-known motto itself wasn't adopted for nearly a decade. And in fact, when Jordan wrote Georgie Crothers, the most influential trustee in 1907, to suggest the German motto, he wrote thoughtfully, "Mottos should be short and in a foreign language." Crothers replied, "It is certainly a splendid motto with splendid associations, but my recollection is that it includes the freedom of both the part of the student and the professor as to what is learned in the method of learning and what is taught in the method of teaching, which is not really recognized in any American college. Would not its adoption imply the adoption of the German university system of instruction and teaching under quite different conditions?" Yes, well, he turned out to have tremendous foresight there. The point is that both portraits of Jordan as champion of academic freedom and Stanford as a place known for the free exchange of ideas emerge in response to this event, right? And indeed, the constraint of that very speech. So our third protagonist, Ross, for his part, did not actually gratuitously harm the institution. From what I gather from the letters and the sources and the secondary literature, Ross actually seems to have understood the precarious financial and legal nature of the institution, which since his arrival had only worsened. In fall of 1900, Jane's most loyal trustee, Crothers, was frantically lobbying for the passage of an amendment to the California Constitution, which would legalize the institutional body of the trustees of the university under California law and grant it a tax exemption in exchange for providing free tuition to the students. And it was an arrangement that Crothers and Jane in particular felt was necessary for the financial survival of the institution. A loyal soldier, Ross waited quietly until the amendment passed and then took center stage as a martyr for the cause, propelling his career to become the founding member of the American Sociological Association in 1905, which he would preside over as president in 1914. landing at Wisconsin, as I mentioned, where he remained at the center of continuing dissent until his death. Right, and here he is, Ross, writing to his colleague Lester Ward, who was his colleague in the founding of the American Sociological Association, telling him, please don't say anything. Right, he really did not want to injure the reputation of this institution to which he had given, his soul, as he would say. But he also says, moreover, my case would be injured by receiving a political taint. So again, a carefully crafted sort of narration and playing out of events that suited what he hoped would happen next, which is what one professor at Stanford called the Great Succession of 1900-1901. In the following months, a total of 7 professors resigned, or 10% of the faculty at its time. And Stanford, as Eliot would say, would never be the same after. Something of the magic spell was broken. Perhaps it was the low point of the university, the infatuation with the West, or the schadenfreude of the Eastern establishment. But Ross's departure was no longer a mere event. It rose to become an affair in the eyes of the nation and the academy. And as a result, the affair catalyzed the transformation of academic freedom from a haphazard sort of custom to a professional ideal. And the crucial link in that next development was the intellectual historian Arthur Lovejoy, one of the 7 to resign. Lovejoy would use this opportunity to form a new professional association that would reestablish the boundaries between science and politics that continue today. So the invention of academic freedom, right? So affairs like that of Ross's had by 1900 become common occurrence. And Dean Satz mentioned the one with Scott Nearing at Wharton, which began in 1910 and was still going in 1915. And this begins already in the 1890s. Right? And each of these patterns, each of these followed a kind of pattern that emerged. A social scientist said something that offended the university's patrons, usually something anti-capitalist on a topic of labor unions or corporate monopolies. They were shushed. And then in the absence of going quiet, the personnel case rose to becoming an affair, right? And this was kind of in the context of America, also just a mounting period for labor-capitalist relations. 1894 was also the year of the Pullman strike, the biggest railroad sort of industry strike in the history of America. Harvard banned political activity in the yard that year, right? So all of these kind of issues outside and inside were coming to a head. And by 1898, a public conversation emerged about the status of the university professors. And this is, I think, an important point. The affairs around Ross and others were as much about a movement afoot to professionalize the American academy and therefore raise the status of the American professor, as it was about the specification of the terms of autonomy, which academics believed they should enjoy. And so you can see over the course of this period, it is kind of unrest. We also see a period of the founding of the various professional associations, the American Economic Association, the American Political Science Association, the American Sociological Association, which were meant to kind of form the basis of this professional world. And at their annual meetings in 1913, the American Economic Association, the American Political Association, and the American Sociological Society each all appointed a committee to study academic freedom and tenure in their respective disciplines and authorize them to work in tandem with other committees. But Lovejoy, who is now a full professor at Hopkins, having worked at Washington University in St. Louis, at Columbia University, at University of Missouri, despite getting a reputation of being something of a troublemaker, he was also an intellectual historian of great renown and now a full professor at Hopkins with some degree of relative degree of power. He saw the need for an organization of professors embracing the entire academic spectrum to engage in advocacy and wrest power from the trustees and these industrialist philanthropists and place it back into the faculty's control. And so in 1913, he sent letters to 17 other full professors at 9 leading universities. He put an ad out in The Nation and Science in 1914 calling for a national association of university professors. The result was the founding of the AAUP, At its first meeting held January 1st and 2nd in 1915 in New York, where John Dewey is named president and Lovejoy is named secretary. Although it might have made more sense to say that Lovejoy was also the de facto investigative agent, because soon thereafter, tipped off by regional newspaper headlines, much like the ones we were just looking at, so-and-so dismissed, Lovejoy got on trains traveling around the country that spring, with Dewey sometimes footing the bill, and he amassed reams of dossiers about the infractions being committed by the less than benevolent university presidents and their boards. In 1915, at least 11 professors were summarily dismissed. Among these, one had spoken favorably of the Roman Catholic Church at the University of Utah, where Mormon influence was profound. Another at Wesleyan had drafted the Workmen's Compensation Act in Middletown, Connecticut, and a law professor at the University of Colorado had represented striking coal miners in a US congressional investigation. So at the AAUP's first annual meeting, Dewey appoints a committee of 15 to consider and report on questions of academic freedom and academic tenure. It was the first of some 16 committees to be authorized, and each are given a kind of alphabetical designation. So we get Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure, thus becomes Committee A. Here are some of the stalwart leading academics who were named to the committee. Roscoe Pound was actually put forward by Ross as the kind of representative from the Sociological Society. And then this team, this all-star team, then authored a report based on this year of investigations, producing this declaration of the principles of academic freedom and academic tenure. The historian of Walter Metzger once called it a philosophical birth cry of academic freedom in the United States. And in it, the authors wrote that academic freedom in this sense comprises three elements: the freedom of inquiry and research, the freedom of teaching within the university, and the freedom of extramural utterance and actions. And I would say it had sort of three goals and accomplishments. One, it made the faculty a self-regulating body of independent appointees. It emphasized the university mission as a knowledge-producing institution, right? The sort of picture that Dean Satz, I think, was presenting that perhaps we take for granted today, this sacred space. This is the space for knowledge advancement and dissemination, right? And this is its mission. Let's reconnect with that. And probably most importantly, and this is what they were most focused on, they try to clarify the fraught relationship between the trustees and the faculty. They try to reestablish or establish the status of professors and a due process for dismissal. And now what I'd like to do is take a look at a couple of the meaningful decisions that they made. So the society had at its helm prominent academics who had trained in Germany. And this was common at the time. Over the course of the 19th century, nearly 10,000 Americans went to study in Germany. Oh, I hear there's a good book out in the hallway about it. I recommend it. Lovejoy, who was born in Germany and studied in the US and France, was actually an exception in this respect. Over half of the signatories of the AAUP's founding declaration had studied or received PhDs in Germany. And for these Americans, the German universities not only represented the highest standards of scholarship, or what the Germans called Wissenschaft, they also were impressed by the intellectual freedom their German colleagues enjoyed there. As they drafted their founding documents of the American Academy, the US was now at war with Germany, and anti-German American nationalism was growing. Indeed, Lovejoy had called the notorious German professor's endorsement of their nation's war effort the most scandalous episode in the history of the scholar's profession. Nonetheless, the AAUP statement opened with an acknowledgement of the German influence, and their formulation of academic freedom was adapted from the German one, as they understood it or wished to present it. The fact was that the Americans greatly exaggerated the freedom they experienced at German universities, a point to which we'll return in the conclusion. But first, they made changes to the concept that were consequential. In Germany, academic freedom encompassed two kinds of freedom, and here I've done my best at sort of creating a genealogy. Lehrfreiheit, the freedom of learning, and Lernfreiheit, the freedom of teaching. The authors announced their interest in the latter, that is freedom for the instructor, not the student so much. In the American version of academic freedom, therefore, Lernfreiheit would be disassociated from Lehrfreiheit. President Van Hise of Wisconsin, for his part, objected that the declaration was written only from the perspective of professors and did not consider the right of students. Van Hise also noted another oversight of the document, the lack of clarity on the relationship to the public. In the German case, that relationship was clear, namely, to borrow Kant's famous formulation, think what you will, but obey. The AAUP authors fashioned a more American and ultimately a more complicated relationship to the public. They argued that university faculty were not employees in the sort of proper sense, they said. They were not hired hands, as Dewey said, but rather more like judges who serve the public through their social function. That's some of the language that they use. Dewey provided the rationale actually as early as 1902, right after the Ross Affair. In Dewey's formulation, scholars received academic freedom in exchange for not meddling in the public debate. And yet that expertise would ultimately make an impact on society. The AAUP argument for academic freedom was ultimately contradictory, and it was uniquely American, a uniquely American progressive era trope, scientific service to the state. One place where this played out was in the connection that they drew between academic freedom on one hand and academic responsibility. Most scholars who supported academic freedom after 1900 did so in a qualified way, qualified by the position that while it would be theoretically beneficial, it must be subordinated to the institution's concern for a respectable reputation. You see this word respect and dignity a lot in this kind of discourse from this time. Shortly after the Ross Affair, the president of Brown University, William Faunce, made an argument that was, I think, typical of this growing position, which is if to this principle of freedom of speech, we add the equally important principle of responsibility for speech, responsibility to the institutions we represent and to the public whose confidence we value, we have a sound and sensible basis for our academic future. But that was a big if. The formulation adopted by Lovejoy and his colleagues in 1915 was a vision of academic freedom, counterbalanced by responsibility, right? And I think I just want to make this crystal clear. After the debacle of the Ross Affair, only a small fraction of American professors themselves desired anything like a pure version of intellectual freedom. The founders of the AEP never intended for academic freedom to be unconstrained, right? And here we read from the 1950 Declaration, such restraints as are necessary should be self-imposed or enforced by the public opinion of the profession. But what is academic responsibility? And how on earth do we determine the public opinion of the profession? Here again is the text. Since there are no rights without corresponding duties, the freedom of the academic teacher entails certain correlative obligations. The claim to the freedom of teaching is made in the interest of the integrity and of the progress of scientific inquiry. It is therefore only those who carry on their work in the temper of the scientific inquirer who may justly assert this claim. Now, I have puzzled long and hard over this passage, and I still don't know what the temper of the scientific inquirer is, much less who decides it. And with every cycle of academic freedom cases that would follow this moment, from the McCarthy era of the 1950s to the Vietnam protests of the 60s and early 70s that led to our own statement of academic freedom in 1974, the law school debates about critical race theory in the 80s, the Yale culture wars of the 90s, up to our current moment, we are reminded of the consequences of the ambiguity of these statements and the stakes of not clarifying. So, okay, I come to Act 3, in which I try to draw everything together to make a few salient points. And I do so by returning to my original question: why historicize ideas like academic freedom? What might we learn? So when we study the past, we emphasize the contingency of ideas, right? Things didn't have to end up this way. Rarely does that process affirm in a straightforward way what we believe. That's because people didn't think about academic freedom the same way then as they do now. When we do this process of historicization, it might also completely undermine our ideas. Or there's kind of a third option. We might recognize that our ideas are contingent, but we are nevertheless committed to them. Either way, historicizing ideas, which is an important part of, I'm arguing, of our response to this current moment, is important, and it can be unsettling. The result is that we engage in reflection about what we have unearthed, and we revise our understanding for the future. So what are the legacies of that history that we have inherited? I'm going to leave you with sort of 3 kind of points too. First, I've tried to suggest that the Ross case and its resolution in the 1915 Declaration never really resolved the tension at the root of the social sciences between understanding and reforming the world. No sooner had the authors insisted that autonomy was required to develop expertise without public interference, and they also insisted that that expertise would improve public conditions. And again, we might return just to the Declaration for a quick reminder in which they say, not all of our political problems have been solved. Grave issues exist, right? And towards the settlement, the university has potentially its own very great contribution to make, right? Maybe we should create impact labs, right? I don't know, right? But the idea is that that impact will indeed be part of the ultimate contribution. Another way to say this is that implicit in the document was a reciprocal agreement between the university and the society, or what Professor Mitchell-Stevens and I have called the academic social contract, to describe a reciprocal agreement between higher education and its patrons about who pays for it and why. But as I've implied, it was not made explicit what was being reciprocated. Moreover, in focusing on tenure and protecting faculty from being fired without due process, they created a kind of circular logic. Tenure was needed for academic freedom, and academic freedom required tenure. The circle was predicated on the idea of a common good for sure, but that common good was never fully described. And this unresolved paradox is reflected, I think, in the existential debate that we're currently experiencing, namely, should the university be oriented towards the search for truth, or should it be oriented towards impact in the world? Okay, second point. The 1915 Declaration defined a boundary between the university and society, rather than defining how self-governance would work within the university. And in this way, the founders presumed that if left to their own devices, the faculty would self-govern harmoniously. Yeah, why not? But in fact, there was little agreement about what that self-government should look like. Lovejoy advocated for what he called the professionalization of the professorate, and he spoke of a self-governing republic of scholars, but not everybody was on board with that. He envisioned a university in which professors assumed more control over the university affairs, but he was very disappointed that the Declaration of 1915 gave too much power to trustees and ultimate oversight, even over this due process that they had laid out for firing. And here's where the American exaggeration of the German notion of academic freedom, I think, is also relevant. Because even though a certain autonomy for higher education was inscribed in the 1850 Prussian Constitution, which stated that the science and its teaching shall be free, that freedom was limited by strong executive power, in particular the power of the culture ministry, which was meant to counterbalance what German education reformers feared would be the inevitable infighting, sort of nepotism of the faculty. Right, so they didn't have such hopes of harmonious self-governance, and they set up a system that sort of was predicated on that more, you could say, pessimistic view. The American assumption that there was a consensus around what harmonious self-governance looked like became even more untenable as time passed, relying on phrases like responsibility and the temper of scientific inquiry may have been okay when the faculty was made up of a small number of white men who all studied in Germany. And even then there were disagreements about whether Ross was irresponsibly claiming the spotlight or acting in good faith. What is the equivalent of the temper of scientific inquiry today? What do we call the simultaneous aspirations for rigorous and inclusive debate? What are its norms and values? What does it mean to argue in good faith for us? These are questions to which we now must devote attention. And here I'm sort of alluding to the argument of positive and negative liberty that Dean Zatz laid out at the outset in urging us to turn to that sort of more positive articulation of academic freedom. Finally, third, the lack of attention to students, other than as receivers of knowledge, have left us with an undeveloped conceptual framework for the relationship among students, precisely the guidance of which we are in need today. And this is a direct consequence of the American signatories of the 19 Declaration dropping that Lernfreiheit, or freedom of learning, side of the two-sided idea of academic freedom and focusing exclusively on Lehrfreiheit, or freedom of teaching. And this is unfortunate, since a main threat to academic freedom today is to students whose learning is jeopardized by fear of cancellation and resulting self-censorship. Developing a new understanding of students' freedom to learn feels to me like the most pressing pedagogical and instructional challenge today. How do we create the preconditions for inclusive and robust discourse in the classroom? So what will be Stanford's story? The final lesson that I'd like to leave you with is that while some of this work is done at the level of the academy, its expression will look different depending on its locality. For example, if we were having this conversation at the University of Florida, Texas, or North Carolina, then the AAUP's prioritization of the external-internal boundary would feel justified. And perhaps even the emphasis of a sort of negative liberty version of academic freedom focusing on the removal of constraints rather than a positive articulation of its mission. At those universities, faculty face pressing threats to their academic freedom from outside, from legislators that are reminiscent of the Ross-era affairs. Conversely, it makes no more sense to adopt a statement from the University of Chicago for Stanford, when that code of speech grows out of a different institution and its distinct histories, customs, and values. Ultimately, while we as an academy will share universal concepts of academic freedom and university speech, the future classroom may look different at Florida, Chicago, and Stanford. We can and should proactively build the distinctive community of which we want to be a part. Each university has its own story, and knowing that story is crucial to creating a fresh understanding of academic freedom and academic responsibility fit for our times, grounded in history, and tailored for our community. Thank you. So I'm told that now we will transition into Q&A, and there are mics circulating in the auditorium. And I know also Leslie will be looking for questions that are coming through the online Q&A chat on Zoom.
Thank you very much for your very illuminating discussion. And I'd like to ask about an issue that occurred around between 2.5 or 3 years ago, shortly after the onset of the COVID pandemic. A professor at the medical school and a large number of his colleagues across the country signed an appeal to consider the relative risks of infection and complications from COVID, rather than necessarily shutting down society and mandating lockdowns. This appeal was referred to as the Great Barrington Declaration. For doing so, this professor at Stanford, and I'm sorry I forgot his name, was subject, thank you, subject to a great deal of censure, from including a signed letter by over 100 Stanford professors across various subjects, condemning him. A simple appeal by the university president, Mark Tessier Levine, to simply remind people that Professor Bhattacharya's remarks should be treated in the context of academic freedom and not be condemned, would have been salutary, but no such statement was forthcoming. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Sure, because in my experience as a present, I will tell you what I would have done. No, I appreciate the question, and certainly a memorable moment, though it occurred before my arrival at Stanford. I think this connects really nicely with the anecdote that Dean Satz mentioned at the outset about the difference between free speech and academic freedom, right? Like you could say that the moon is made of blue cheese, but that might be something that's permissible in the realm of free speech. But that when you're engaging in the rules of academic freedom, then you are judged by your colleagues, all of those professional associations, right, that were created in the 1880s and 1890s and continue to be created, including in this case, the American Medical Association, right? Those are the bodies, those are the bodies that determine whether or not a statement like the moon is made of blue cheese is permissible in the context of academic discourse. I'm not sure it's actually the president's responsibility to weigh in on that. I see kind of these debates as being much more kind of disciplinary focused. And so, that's kind of how it works, right? Someone makes a claim and a community of scholars determine whether or not they think it's founded on data, on method, and ultimately a reasonable in the temper of scientific inquiry, right? I think it's the latter, the temper of scientific inquiry, where the kind of fuzziness actually gets in, right? And you see this in the case of Ross, right? Was he making the argument really in good faith, or was he making the argument to make a political point? And I think that, to me, is the really important question that someone in leadership has to determine, and one has to determine that on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, I see some questions over here. Yeah.
Hi.
Please say your name.
Pardon me?
If you feel free to introduce yourself.
Tom Wasso. You mentioned that toward the end that different universities should have different positions on academic freedom. There's been, I think, a few hundred faculty members here who signed a petition to have the University of Chicago statement on academic freedom endorsed by the Stanford administration. And my question is, what is the difference between Stanford and Chicago that made you say that each institution should have its own statement on academic freedom?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's definitely it's sort of an ongoing discussion. I mean, this comes back to my argument that every university, every institution has its own identity. It has its own story, and that it's wrong to think that each institution is going to look exactly the same. When institutions start imitating one another, right, in this sort of imitative relationship that sociologists like to call isomorphism, right, is when we start to lose the distinctiveness, the variety, the heterogeneity of for which the American higher education system is known. So that's kind of a first point. We should always, thank you so much. We should always proceed with caution before we adopt a policy or a program or an idea from another institution. In the case of Chicago versus Stanford, though they were founded at the same time, also by with private philanthropy, they had very different characters and continue to have very different characters. From the beginning, its founding president, Harper, had a much more sort of capacious embrace of the idea of academic freedom in the German sense. And over the years, different leaders at Chicago iterated on that and in a way kind of emphasized and doubled down on that, making Chicago a place that was an expression of a kind of absolutist or purist expression of absolute freedom. One that focused very much on the removal of constraints as being the most important kind of criterion for academic freedom, and less so on what that academic freedom was for, right? That negative positive distinction that we were talking about earlier. And I think it works for that institution because it's deeply embedded in the institutional, what's called the institutional saga of that university. One goes to University of Chicago because they opt into that community and they expect something of that experience. But I think Stanford has a very different story. And part of what I'm trying to do here is and with my team and in our class, with Professor Stevens and with Josh Snyder and with our graduate students and our undergraduates, I'm so glad are here today, is to try to unearth what that story is as a way of reconnecting with it to determine what Stanford's version of that will look like. Michael?
Oh, yeah. We have a couple of questions from our esteemed colleague, Peter Stansky. So ultimately, how important was the Ross Affair for the formation of the AAUP? It sounds as if it was more part of a movement that was already on its way. And secondly, why do you think there are so few Stanford members of the AAUP? Shouldn't there be more?
Both good questions. Yeah, I mean, I've puzzled over sort of the causation, you could say, of the Ross Affair to the founding of the AAUP. Obviously, I've made a kind of strong kind of rhetorical connection for the purposes of our discussion tonight. And I think it's a helpful heuristic also for unearthing, as I was saying, the story of Stanford. You know, is it the straw that broke the camel's back or whatever kind of, you know, was it the main catalyst? I don't think so. I mean, I think World War I was, but that's a whole other sort of story. And I had to sort of eliminate that nuance for the purposes of this presentation, right? I mean, World War I made very clear kind of the way in particular that the German academics with whom these American academics were corresponding and believed that they had these very pure friendships and collaborations in pursuit of truth on a dime just were undermined by this massive war, and that those friends that they had, those relationships that were really hurt in the process, because those friends then immediately sided with their nation, right, in 1914. And in fact, they made this declaration to this effect rather than siding with the cosmopolitan values of science, right? And as I mentioned, Lovejoy said that this was like the most scandalous episode in the history of the field. And so I think it's in this moment when that kind of bargain in the German case becomes clear, and soon constraints are going to be made on the American population as well about what can be said about the war and what can't. That it's sort of in response to that constraint. Academic freedom is created as an idea, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So I mean, to me, that's the stronger sort of causation if we're going to talk about historical causation. But there's no doubt that the Ross Affair sort of retains this kind of almost like mythological status in the history of affairs, and I think that has more to do with the way that Stanford was emerging on the scene as the newest institution that, as I mentioned from the beginning, sort of Easterners were watching with bated breath to see like whether this startup would make it or not. And that kind of the intrigue of these idiosyncratic characters that I spent a lot of time kind of drawing, the single trustee, Jane, this woman, right? All of this kind of then, made that affair a kind of exemplar then of the founding of the AAUP.
The question back here. Hi, I'm Hank Greeley from the law school, and I bought and read your book in October 2021. Excellent book, excellent presentation. I have a comment that's really not about your talk, but then a question, just as a matter of clarification. The letter that was referred to earlier was not about Jay Bhattacharya and the Great Barrington Declaration. It was about Scott Atlas. And I think those two are actually in quite different, that's an important difference. But back to your talk, the racist side of Ross has always kind of intrigued me. And the sort of conservative and liberal positions about Asian immigration in that era were a little different from what we might expect now. Do you think that the racism significantly motivated either Jane or Jordan, or was it more the populism, the aligning himself partisanly with the populists?
I mean, the reason why I presented Ross and Jordan in this way was to emphasize the progressive era milieu in which Jordan and Ross and their colleagues found themselves. So, if they were all eugenicists, it couldn't have been racism, right? I mean, and this was the case. I mean, where I think the distinction comes in goes back to that point about the temper of scientific inquiry, right? Did Ross need to accept an invitation, for the United Labor Association that he knew would probably get out of hand? Did he need to make this incendiary comment about turning the guns on the boats of the Japanese? No, but he writes to his stepmother in these correspondence that he was very proud of his oratory. He's proud that, you know, the speeches he's making are making it into the newspaper. So it's clear that he's kind of seeking this kind of spotlight to make these points. And for me, that actually is more what kind of tips the balance against Ross. And I think it's the kind of, you know, more interesting point for us today, because I think it's something we have to continue to grapple with, right? As professors develop expertise, as I've said, and we assume that they will in some way make an impact in the world, but one has to use judgment, restraint, responsibility, duty, right? So goes the 1915 Declaration, to determine in what way, when, and how, right? And so I think that's part, like the flamboyance of all of it, you know, exposed, you know, unearthed the tension that was there all along. My view. Yeah.
Hi, I'm alumni from class of '84, and I'm curious in the context of a rally for science that I attended in 2017 in San Jose, where people were chanting, "What do we want? Science. When do we want it? After peer review."
Right.
And I'm wondering and curious about the similarities and differences between academic freedom and the scientific processes.
Right.
And wondering if you can comment on those.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was just looking for my list of the associations. Yeah, so what do we want science? When do we want after peer review? So it's not pure inquiry, right? If it's disciplined by the disciplines, right? And that brings us back to the question of that self-governance. Like, how do we, you know, and the assumption that, you know, if we could just get these politicians off of our back, if like these industrialists would stop getting in our way, we would live harmoniously in like a world of cosmopolitan values of science and pure inquiry. And, you know, one thing that Joan Scott does really well in her new book on academic freedom is that she shows that, you know, this contradiction makes no sense when you actually consider the fact that politics is also what catalyzes change in the academy, and academies were just, you know, were made up of hierarchies and politics, right? So it seems just like even more naive to think that the sort of the community of scholars was governing itself in, you know, would govern itself, you know, in this way that wasn't influenced by power and status and hierarchy and these kinds of things. So I mean, I do think that is one of the kind of ironies of this professionalization and the creation of the autonomy as embedded, you know, within the system in which the governing body are these imperfect associations and processes like peer review. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of critique that's been mounting about those kinds of mechanisms, and, you know, certain fields, like I think in physics, they just put their equations like up online. I mean, there's just sort of like, we don't bother with that, you know, there's only 10 of us and we read each other's work and we decide if it's true or not, right? So there's like other models kind of emerging, more open source stuff, other journals that are less hierarchical. And I think that's kind of how you would get at that kind of adjacent issue. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, Anthony, who's watching online, says, wonderful talk and analysis. I'm curious about the role of university presidents during this time. It was an era of fairly strong, powerful presidencies. For example, Charles Eliot at Harvard and William Rainey Harper at Chicago. Was the time ripe for academic freedom activism to respond to authority and overreach of powerful presidents, as much as a principled, quote unquote, principled stand for the pursuit of knowledge? Is there a presidential story here?
Yes, which Anthony is that? Is that my colleague, Anthony? Okay, forget it. I want to know who's online. So, okay, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that there is a story here about certainly Lovejoy and his colleagues were worried about the power that had coalesced in 2 or 3 particular places, right? One was in the presidents, which you know, have sometimes been called the benevolent monarchs of this period, and not so benevolent monarchs. 2 was the kind of, you know, the philanthropists who thought that the universities were theirs, right? Jane was well within her right to determine what could be said, right? And therefore dictating what could be said. But then third was, there was also the kind of connection between the two. We didn't talk about the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching that's founded at basically the same time in 1905, and begins to use kind of incentives of pensions to bring academic communities, bring colleges together under a kind of system to standardize them, to create hierarchies, right? I mean, Carnegie would have just an outsized amount of power and it seemed like he was gaining in his power in this first decade of the 20th century. So I think that people like Cattell and the psychologist at Columbia, Seligman, the economist, Lovejoy, they were trying to wrest that power back from these different parties, the presidents, the industrialists, and these new philanthropists with their the gifts and benefits that they were offering scholars, and trying to sort of bring it back to the faculty where they thought it should rightly lie.
Hello, Professor Levine knows, but my name is Peter Ross, and Edward Elzers Ross was my grandfather. I'm a retired mathematician from Santa Clara University. My question is, I just finished reading this fascinating book by Stanford historian Richard White, Who Killed Jane Stanford? And it definitely portrays both Jane Stanford and David Starr Jordan as bad guys, simplistically, and my grandfather is a good guy. I assume you've read this book, and how accurate is that appraisal of the whole situation?
So you read White's narrative as presenting Ross as a good guy in sort of tension with the bad guys, right? No, you just played chess with him growing up. Well, I mean, I have the utmost respect for Richard White, and everybody should read the book, especially his earlier work on Railroaded, on the creation of the transatlantic railroad industry, and sort of all of his work on the American West. I think this is a wonderful book as well. And he writes at the beginning that it's written in the style of kind of almost like a crime, nonfiction, in the style that his brother, who's a crime novelist, writes in. So, I mean, in some of my more dramatic moments today, I'm sort of channeling my dramatic persona as well. And I think, when you write a history in that way, then inevitably, you are making normative judgments about how you're presenting your protagonists to create a kind of arc. You're imploding a kind of story throughout the book. And I think it's a good book for that. That's not the project that I was doing here, which I tried to set up a different kind of project, one of historicization, to understand these characters, less for whether they were bad or good or sort of right or wrong, but more for how their actions and how their own sort of self-fashioning of their actions created the conditions for the possibility of the founding of the major professional association and the academy that drew boundaries between society and politics, between ideas and the world, that are essentially the ones that we've inherited today. Other questions?
Peter wanted me to nudge you again on the second part of his question about.
I don't know why more Stanford professors don't join the AAUP, and Deborah's left, so she can't address it. I suppose it probably has something to do with, again, coming back to the Stanford story and what kind of institution that this is. Ross would end up at Wisconsin, as we heard before, and Wisconsin would kind of carve out its space for itself as an institution of dissent, and an institution where much more dissent was permissible than at other kinds of institutions. Again, to the point of different institutions have different kind of identities. Maybe this campus, isn't sort of, isn't a hotbed for political activism in the same way. But those would be kind of the explanatory principles that you might bring to think about that. But I see my colleague, Professor Stevens, has the mic, and I'd love to hear what he says about this.
Yeah, here's another, I'm really glad it's on this slide. So, I mean, a very crass way of thinking about the invention of academic freedom was it was a move on the part of a relatively weak occupational group to claim autonomy, right? And we'll wrap ourselves in this grand commitment, this wonderful promise, right, of academic freedom. But to what extent? And I'm really glad you called out that this happens at exactly the same time that academics are trying to become sort of more than mere employees. But I wonder if you could just press you a little bit more to talk about, like, how cynical should a social scientist be in thinking about, the extent to which we were basically doing this to, get paid, get status, and get permanent employment, right?
Yeah, spoken like a social scientist. So as the intellectual, this is why we're such good team, Mitchell. Because I, as an intellectual historian, live more in the land of Wissenschaft and ideals. But there's no doubt that there were very pragmatic, very practical goals that these men had, right? And concerns about pay and security. Whether or not Jordan was going to fire you after a year. We're definitely at the forefront. I mean, I think this is where, as we've been talking about in our class, like, individuals do things for all sorts of reasons, right? I mean, were the Stanfords magnanimous, and, did they give back to the children of California and create an institution that was more, as we would say today, access oriented, those in the East Coast? Absolutely. Did they also do this, with money that, came from this railroad industry in which layers and layers of speculation had led to a lot of debt and kind of, and perhaps some shady dealings along the way? Yes, also that, right? So I think the idealist story and the practical story, can run hand in hand. And some of the infighting between Lovejoy and Cattell and Seligman, and we're sort of debating these things. I think Cattell was much more of a James Cattell, the psychologist at Columbia, is like much more of a kind of troublemaker, like Ross, who was constantly just like attacking Nicholas Murray Butler at Columbia, and was like just asking to get fired, right? Like he was, and then he and his buddies moved downtown in 1919 and founded the New School for Social Research. So, there was sort of, they're different protagonists also played different roles in this drama, as I've tried to suggest. And Lovejoy tended to be more of the idealist type than Cattell, the troublemaker, Seligman, the sound economist. So I think that's part, understanding those different characters also helps to bring the idealist and the practical together as they rightly were in the creation of this important moment.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Professor Levine, for that incredible presentation.
Thank you.